The house on Ashberry Lane had always looked like it belonged in a painting: white picket fence, red shutters, the porch swaying even when no one sat in it. To most, it seemed idyllic. But to Claire, it was a place of silence. A place of watching. A place she hadn't returned to in 17 years. She stood in front of it now, keys in hand, her rental car still idling at the curb. It was early spring in Portland, Oregon. The cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom along the sidewalks, but the air still held winter's chill. Her coat felt too thin, her breath visible in the morning light. Claire hadn't planned to stay long. Her mother's death hadn't surprised her. The woman had been fading for years, first consumed by a stroke that left her without speech, then gradually worn down by time itself. The call came on a rainy Monday morning. Hospice. Peaceful passing. No pain. Claire had nodded numbly. Thanked them. Booked the flight. There were no tears. Only a strange, quiet sense of obligation. Now she was here. The key clicked in the lock. The door opened with the same long, reluctant creak she remembered from her childhood. The scent of lavender and old paper hit her immediately, thick and familiar. Inside, the house was untouched. The same beige couch. The same worn rug. The same family portrait on the wall: her mother, her father, and herself at 12 years old. No one had updated it since. She stared at her younger self, frozen in time, smiling in a sweater she remembered hating. Claire stepped inside slowly, as if expecting to be scolded for tracking in dust. Her heels clicked softly against the wood floors. She passed through the living room, into the kitchen, where the light from the window caught the dust in the air like floating stars. The kitchen table still held a vase with dried flowers. A calendar from 5 years ago hung on the wall. Everything looked suspended, as if time had paused the moment she left. It looked the same. Except now it belonged to her. She wandered into the hallway. Her old bedroom door was still painted light blue, a little chipped around the edges. When she pushed it open, the wave of memory nearly knocked her back. Her breath caught in her throat. The room had been preserved like a shrine. Posters of 90s pop bands. A dusty bulletin board of school awards and soccer ribbons. A bookshelf lined with teen novels, their spines cracked with time. Her twin bed was still made, the comforter tucked in with hospital corners, as if her mother had expected her to return at any moment. A stuffed bear, Bentley, sat upright on the pillow, smiling the same stitched smile he'd had for decades. Claire sat on the bed and looked around. It felt too small. She felt too big. The woman she had become didn't belong here, not anymore. But some part of her had remained in this room all these years. Waiting. Wounded. In the closet, she found a box labeled Claire's Things. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to her. Most never sent. Some opened, some not. One from her father, dated 3 years after he left. One from an aunt she barely remembered. Several from her mother, never mailed. She took a breath and pulled out the one on top. Her mother's cursive danced across the page. Claire. I made your favorite today. Mac and cheese with breadcrumbs. You used to call it crunchy top. I still make too much, just in case you walk through the door. Maybe tomorrow. She folded the letter carefully. Her throat tightened. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the envelope. In the back of the box was a cassette tape. No label. Just her name written in Sharpie. Claire stared at it. Did they even make cassette players anymore? Downstairs, she rummaged through drawers until she found the old stereo in the den. Miraculously, it still worked. She slid the tape in, pressed play, and waited. There was a hiss. A click. Then her mother's voice. Claire. If you're listening to this, I guess I'm gone. Claire froze. I never knew how to say things out loud. You knew that. You were always so much braver than me. Even when you were little. You used to stand up for yourself. I used to be proud, and then scared. Scared you'd realize how small I'd let myself become. The voice cracked. You always asked why I didn't leave when your father did. Why I stopped talking about it. The truth is, I didn't know how. He left, and I stayed. And then I disappeared, too, just slower." Claire sat perfectly still. The room felt like it was closing in. Her mother's voice, once so distant, now filled the space like a haunting melody. "I know you think I didn't fight for you. And maybe I didn't. Not the way I should have. But I never stopped loving you, Claire. Not once." There was a pause. Then a whisper. "I hope one day you'll come home. Not for me. For you. Because I know what it's like to carry silence. And you deserve to put it down." The tape clicked off. Claire stared at the stereo, unmoving. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Of everything that had never been said. That night, she sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by letters and memories and ghosts. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she pulled out a pen and wrote. "I'm here. And I'm listening." She looked around the room again. Slowly, she began gathering the letters and stacking them on the desk. She folded the comforter back on the bed. She opened the window. Let fresh air in. She didn't know what would come next. But she was staying. At least for now. Claire woke up the next morning to birdsong outside her childhood window and the muted smell of old wood and dust. She had slept on the same twin bed she left at 17, her body curled into a shape too small for the woman she now was. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, the letter, the tape, the unspoken forgiveness carried on her mother's voice. But the box of letters still sat on the desk. The window was still cracked open. It was all real. She rose and made coffee in the same kitchen where her mother used to stand every morning at 7 a.m., humming old jazz songs and cracking eggs like clockwork. There were no eggs now. No breakfast smells. Just the hum of the fridge and the creak of floorboards. Claire wandered from room to room, touching objects she hadn't seen in years. The dented piano in the corner. The vase her mother never moved. The couch cushion with the loose thread she used to pick it when nervous. Everything had stayed the same, frozen in the life her mother had built, and protected. In the hallway, she stopped outside her mother's room. She hesitated before opening the door, hand resting on the knob. Inside, the room was pristine. Not just tidy, intentional. The bed was made, the dresser dusted. A shawl was folded neatly over the chair in the corner. On the nightstand sat a small stack of books, all bookmarked part away through. Claire sat on the edge of the bed. She noticed the faint indent where her mother's body used to rest, pressed into the mattress like a memory. She looked around and took a deep breath. Then she began opening drawers. Not trifling, not rushing, just discovering. Most held clothes, carefully folded. Perfume bottles. A string of pearls. A faded photo of Claire's father, face young and unaware. And then, in the drawer beneath the sink in the bathroom attached to the room, she found a stack of notebooks wrapped in a silk scarf. Claire carried them back to the bedroom and sat cross-legged on the floor. The first notebook opened to a page dated 4 months after Claire left for college. Today I walked into her room and realized I had forgotten the way she leaves her pillows when she wakes up, angled, like she expects to return. Each page after that was a quiet record of a woman trying to make sense of a world that had grown silent. Grocery lists followed by confessions. Dream fragments followed by guilt. There were no dramatic declarations. Just breadcrumbs of longing. Claire read for hours. She paused only once to drink water, then returned to the pages like they were air. At some point, she realized she wasn't crying, not because she didn't want to, but because what she felt was too deep, too slow, to be tears. It was grief, but not just for her mother. It was for the years lost between them. The misunderstandings that had calcified into silence. The birthdays missed. The letters unread. One entry, written just a year ago, struck her hardest. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me. But I forgive myself for staying alive long enough to hope she might." Claire closed the notebook and pressed her hand to its cover. That evening, she called Marissa. "You're still there?" her friend asked, voice full of soft surprise. "Yeah. I found some things. Letters, tapes, journals. Aunt? Claire hesitated. I don't know. I feel like I'm talking to a version of my mom I never met. Marissa was quiet for a beat. Then, maybe she wanted you to. Now. When you were ready. Claire nodded, though her friend couldn't see it. You're going to stay a while, aren't you? Marissa asked. Claire looked around at the house. At the books, the half-read lives, the memories she had once locked away. I think I need to. After the call, Claire stepped out onto the porch for air. The wind was crisp, but not cruel. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same mailboxes. Same cracked pavement on the corner. A few kids rode bikes past her, their laughter trailing like ribbons. The swing on the porch still creaked. She sat in it for a long time, letting the motion soothe her. Then, almost without thinking, she went back inside and pulled out a fresh notebook from the drawer beside the phone, the kind her mother used. She sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not to her mother. Not to herself. Just to begin. The house creaks when it's quiet. But today, it feels less like a warning and more like a welcome. I didn't think I would find anything here but dust and regret. But I found her. I found me. She wrote until the light faded, and then she turned on the kitchen lamp and wrote some more. At midnight, she closed the notebook and placed it gently on the counter. Tomorrow, she would clean out the attic. She wasn't ready to let the house go. Not yet. She wasn't here to say goodbye. She was here to understand. The next morning, Claire stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, flashlight in hand, debating whether or not to climb. The wooden steps looked smaller than she remembered, steeper somehow. The overhead light didn't work anymore. She took a deep breath and started up. The attic smelled like cedar and thyme. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the beam from her flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness. Cobwebs clung to the eaves, and boxes lined both walls, each labeled in her mother's meticulous handwriting. Christmas ornaments. Claire's baby clothes. Old tax files. Books for donation. She crouched beside a box labeled photo albums and peeled back the tape. Inside were leather-bound volumes, each filled with carefully arranged photographs. Claire flipped one open and found a picture of her 5th birthday, paper crowns, chocolate frosting, and her mother smiling in the background, eyes soft, chin tilted toward her daughter. She hadn't remembered her mother smiling like that. Another album showed summers at the lake, family road trips, school concerts. With each turn of the page, the images aged, her father slowly disappearing from frame. First, he stood off to the side. Then, only Claire and her mom. Then just Claire. At the bottom of the box was a scrapbook labeled Letters Never Sent. Claire hesitated, then opened it. Each page held a letter, glued in carefully like it belonged in a museum. Claire. Today you turned 17. You wore your hair up and rolled your eyes when I took your picture. I pretended not to notice the tear in your voice when you said, I can't wait to leave this house. I wonder if you knew that every time you said that, it broke me a little. Claire exhaled. She didn't remember saying it out loud, but she had thought it. Countless times. She read another. Claire. I told myself I wouldn't cry when you left for college. But the night you drove away, I sat in your room and held your old sweatshirt. I wanted to tell you that I was proud. That you were brave. But I never found the words, and by the time I did, you had stopped answering my calls. Claire closed the scrapbook gently and sat with it in her lap. The silence in the attic was deep, but it didn't feel empty. It felt inhabited, by memory, by love, by the weight of everything unsaid. As the morning light seeped through the attic window, she noticed another box tucked behind a trunk. It was labeled Family History. Inside were documents, birth certificates, a faded marriage license, hospital bracelets, report cards. But beneath them was something she hadn't expected, a journal belonging to her grandmother. Claire flipped it open. October 12, 1961. My daughter doesn't speak much anymore. Not since he left. She watches everything, though. So much like me. Too much. She skimmed the pages. Pain passed down like heirlooms. Silence inherited like blue eyes. The journal detailed years of quiet endurance, her grandmother staying for the children, her mother growing up in the same patterns, then unknowingly continuing them. Claire sat back on her heels, heart pounding. Was this why her mother had never spoken up? Because no one before her ever had. She returned to the kitchen just after noon, the attic's secrets still stirring in her chest. She poured a glass of water and stood by the window, staring at the overgrown garden. In the distance, a neighbor walked her dog, waving politely. For the first time since arriving, Claire waved back. That afternoon, she began clearing out the living room. She sorted through shelves of old books, dusted frames, opened drawers. It was slow work, but she didn't mind. The house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a place with breath. She found a painting tucked behind the bookshelf, a watercolor of the house, vibrant and full of light. On the back was a note in her mother's hand. Painted this the week Claire moved out. I needed to remember it still held love. That night, she sat at the kitchen table again, her new journal open. The attic holds ghosts, but not the kind I feared. They're tender. Familiar. They carry sorrow, yes, but also intention. My mother didn't speak because no one ever taught her how. But she wrote. She left a trail. She paused, pen hovering. Maybe the way we heal isn't by demanding answers. Maybe it's by listening to the ones that were whispered, quietly, just in case we'd return. Claire closed the journal and let the quiet settle. Upstairs, the attic door was still ajar, the light still soft. She would return. There was more to read. More to unearth. But for now, it was enough. Tomorrow, she'd call the lawyer. She didn't know if she would sell the house. Maybe. Maybe not. What she did know was that it no longer felt like someone else's space. It felt like a part of her. The morning sun was unusually warm for early spring, streaming through the sheer curtains in Claire's old bedroom and gently nudging her awake. She blinked up at the ceiling, the same pale plaster, the same water stain from a leak long ago, and felt the unfamiliar sense of peace that had begun settling into her chest. It had been 5 days since she arrived, 5 days of unearthing her family's past one memory at a time. Claire had come expecting to pack boxes and make decisions. Instead, she had unraveled a story she never knew she was a part of. One layered in silence, sorrow, and something like love. She stretched and walked barefoot down the hallway, her fingertips grazing the wallpaper as she passed. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled over the gas stove as she prepared tea. She didn't rush. She no longer felt the need to fill every moment with action. Today, she would go into the backyard. The garden had been a fixture of her childhood. Her mother had once tended it with care, tomatoes in neat rows, herbs spilling over from clay pots, a lattice of roses by the fence. But when Claire stepped outside now, she found a different scene. Nature had reclaimed it. Weeds sprouted through the stone path. The lattice lay cracked and leaning. The old oak tree had dropped limbs heavy with moss. And yet, the bones of the garden were still there, resilient, waiting. Claire walked the overgrown path slowly, remembering how her mother used to kneel in the dirt, gloved hands patient, humming Billie Holiday under her breath. Claire would sit nearby with a book, only half reading, more interested in her mother's movements than the words on the page. There was a small door at the far end of the fence, what her mother called the garden door. Claire had never asked where it led. It had always been locked. But now, the latch was rusted, the wood soft. She tugged at it. It opened. Beyond it lay a narrow path leading into the woods behind the neighborhood, the kind of place that felt both forbidden and magical. She stepped through, surprised at how natural it felt. A few feet in, nestled among ferns and low branches, she found a bench, weathered, almost hidden. A plaque on it read, "For Margaret," who watched things grow, even when no one else did. Margaret was her grandmother. Claire sat down slowly, letting the quiet envelop her. She could almost see her mother sitting here, maybe as a young girl, maybe later, holding thoughts too heavy to share aloud. She pulled out her notebook. The garden behind the house was never just a garden. It was a sanctuary. A place where silence wasn't empty, it was sacred. I wonder how many times she came here to cry. Or to breathe. Or to just be. She closed the notebook and looked up. The sun filtered through the leaves like stained glass. And in that moment, she didn't feel alone. Later that day, she cleared a section of the garden. Hands in dirt, hair tied up, sleeves rolled. It was physical, grounding work. She pulled weeds, trimmed branches, unearthed forgotten bulbs. Every now and then, she'd find something familiar, a broken garden gnome, a rusted trowel, the tiny stone frog she had once named Henry. At dusk, she stood at the center of it all, sweaty, tired, smiling. The garden wasn't whole yet, but it was hers again. That evening, while flipping through one of her mother's notebooks at the kitchen table, she found a folded sheet tucked into the back cover. It was a poem. Not dated. Not signed. But clearly her mother's handwriting. I watched the garden grow, then die, then bloom again. The way mothers do. I buried dreams beneath rose roots. Pruned away the parts that bloomed too wild. I never asked the wind to stay. But I always hoped you'd return to smell the thyme. Claire read the words again and again. She didn't cry. She smiled. Because for the first time, she saw her mother not as the woman who had remained silent, but as someone who had spoken, just in a language Claire hadn't understood at the time. That night, Claire took a hot shower and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Her face, framed in steam, looked different. Not younger. Not older. Just clearer. Like something within her had settled. She called Marissa. "Still there?" her friend asked. "Yeah. I found the garden." There was a pause. Then, "Of course you did. It's wild, but beautiful," Claire said. Like it was waiting. Maybe it was. They spoke for a while. About life, about grief, about rediscovery. When they hung up, Claire sat on the porch swing, watching moths swirl around the porch light. The next morning, she returned to the garden with a watering can and planted lavender near the bench. It was her mother's favorite. She sat there until noon, reading aloud from the letters she had once ignored. She read to the garden. To the wind. To herself. And for the first time, it felt like someone, something, was listening. On the morning of her 9th day at the house on Ashberry Lane, Claire stood in the living room, holding a paint swatch in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The sun filtered through the front windows, casting soft rectangles on the wooden floor. Dust floated like dandelion seeds, undisturbed. The room still looked like her mother's. Same beige walls. Same floral curtains. Same heavy furniture. But Claire wasn't the same. And neither was the silence. She set her coffee down and walked to the corner of the room where a small bookshelf leaned slightly forward. She'd been ignoring it for days, even though it had caught her attention on her first walk through. There was a drawer built into the bottom, shallow, old, and likely swollen shut from years of humidity. She knelt down and pulled gently. It resisted. She pulled harder. It gave way with a wooden groan. Inside was a single object. A small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to her. Not in her mother's handwriting. But her father's. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't thought about him in years. Not really. He had walked out when she was 14. Left no forwarding address. No explanation. Just an absence that became permanent. She stared at the envelope for a long time before sliding a finger beneath the flap. Claire. If you're reading this, I probably don't deserve it. I told myself I'd write to you one day when I had something worth saying. I waited too long. I never thought your mother would keep this, but I hope you find it. I left because I was weak. Because I thought staying would break us all. And I thought you were better off without me. But that wasn't fair. You were a child. You deserved more. Your mother loved you fiercely. I didn't always understand how she showed it, but I knew she never stopped trying. I hope you'll forgive us both one day. Dad. Claire folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling. For so many years, she had thought she was the only one left behind. But this house held so many echoes of people who had tried, and failed, in their own flawed ways. Her mother. Her father. Her grandmother. Each of them had been navigating grief and fear without a map. She stood and looked around the room again. The paint swatch in her hand suddenly felt more symbolic than decorative. That afternoon, she went into town. She hadn't planned to. But something told her it was time. She drove past the bookstore she used to visit as a child, the diner where her mother once took her for milkshakes on Sundays. They were still there. Still open. Still alive. At the hardware store, she bought paint, warm ivory for the living room, deep sage for the kitchen. Brushes, rollers, tape. At the nursery, she picked up lavender, thyme, and a young hydrangea bush. Back home, she opened every window in the house. She turned on music, Billie Holiday, and began to paint. With every stroke of the roller, she felt something uncoil inside her. This wasn't just redecorating. It was reclaiming. It was rewriting. As she moved furniture, she found more of her mother's secrets. Old notes tucked into cookbooks, annotated poetry collections, a shoebox full of ticket stubs from concerts Claire never knew she'd attended. A woman in full color, revealed through fragments. The house came alive. When the walls dried, Claire rearranged the furniture, bringing in light. She swapped out the curtains for linen ones she found in the upstairs closet. She framed one of her mother's watercolors and hung it over the fireplace. She placed the journal from the attic on the coffee table. Not hidden. Visible. One evening, as she sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Green, walked over. "Claire?" she asked. Claire stood. "Hi, Mrs. Green. It's been a long time. You look like your mother," the older woman said kindly. "I saw the windows open. Thought maybe you were moving in." Claire hesitated. "I haven't decided yet. I came to clean things up. But now. It doesn't feel like I'm just visiting." Mrs. Green smiled. "Your mother loved this house. But it loved her back through you. It's good to see it full of light again." After she left, Claire sat in the swing, thinking. She hadn't planned to stay this long. Her apartment back in San Francisco was still waiting. Her job, her friends, her life. But this felt like something else. A return. Not just to a place. To herself. She pulled out her notebook. "Maybe we come home not because it's easy, but because it's honest. Because it's where the truth lives, even when it hurts. I used to think silence was a punishment. But now I see it as a language, a place where stories hide until we're ready to hear them." That night, she dreamed of her mother, not sick, not silent, but young and vibrant, her hands covered in garden soil, her eyes laughing. Claire woke with tears on her cheeks. But they weren't bitter. They were full. In the morning, she made a list. Replace porch light. Frame family photos. Clean out garage. Call lawyer about transfer of deed. Register for writing workshop. It surprised her, that last item. But something in her had shifted. She didn't just want to process the past. She wanted to write it. Shape it. Share it. A week later, Marissa arrived with 2 duffel bags and a box of wine. "So this is the famous house," she said, stepping inside. "Smells like lemon and lavender." "I've been cleaning," Claire said. And remembering. They spent the weekend repainting the upstairs hallway, cooking in the newly organized kitchen, and reading old letters aloud like bedtime stories. On Sunday night, they sat in the garden, candles flickering on the stone steps. "Are you going to keep it?" Marissa asked gently. Claire looked at the house. The windows glowing. The hydrangeas blooming. "I think it kept me," she said.